No heroes here. Straight hockey podcast versus straight hockey podcast. This video is neither a defense nor an indictment of the Empty Netters podcast or of DJ Bean, one of the hosts from the What Chaos podcast. It is a genuine attempt by me to understand a specific moment in hockey pop culture where visibility, money, identity, and status has clearly collided, and why this collision has made so many people upset, and why it's made me feel extremely uncomfortable for a variety of reasons. I'm not here to laud any heroes because I simply don't think that there are any in this scenario. I'm very interested in what happens when something that was once niche, ironic, or ironic adjacent suddenly becomes mainstream, and when the people who built their identities on being early realize they're no longer special. Before Heated Rivalry, we'd seen breakout successes with things like Game of Thrones, Bridgerton, Squid Game, Tiger King, The Office, Breaking Bad, Stranger Things. Shows that suddenly became shows that everyone was talking about in the most unexpected places. So, in terms of setting the scene about hockey, masculinity, and the pop culture crossover, for decades, hockey culture has been defined by restraint. Players are supposed to say less, feel less. They're not supposed to be earnest unless it's about winning. Anything emotional or openly romantic is treated with suspicion. Romance is considered odd if it doesn't center around women. So when a queer hockey romance like Heated Rivalry broke containment, not just amongst romance readers, but inside mainstream hockey discourse, it was no longer just a TV or book phenomenon. It became a cultural stress test. The people who reacted to it weren't reacting from neutral ground. They reacted from inside an ecosystem that had been shaped by clout, analytics, and proximity to being seen as culturally relevant. Before I dive into interpreting what I think has happened, it's worth laying out the basic sequence of events. As mentioned, Heated Rivalry is a queer hockey romance that crossed over from a niche audience into wider attention. It has now been referenced in mainstream legal, sports, and entertainment contexts, including even in a recent New York court hearing where Justin Baldoni's lawyer, Jonathan Bach, cited the show while arguing about whether sexual harassment on a film or television set must always be gendered. At this point, the show is no longer circulating only within queer or romance spaces. It's been discussed by NHL teams, by their social media admin, referenced by the league itself. Gary Bettman said he binge-watched it. It's been covered by major mainstream outlets, and it is being treated as a legitimate cultural touchstone rather than a niche curiosity. The two lead actors have even been announced as torchbearers for the upcoming Winter Olympics, a level of symbolic visibility that would have been unthinkable for such a small, low-budget Canadian production only months earlier. As that happened, a number of hockey podcasts began talking about it. The first was What Chaos early on, and the Empty Netters followed perhaps a couple of weeks later. For reasons I'll go into later, the Empty Netters recaps quickly drew a much larger audience than most other coverage. Their episodes travelled further, became viral, picked up new viewers who weren't already embedded in hockey podcast culture, and eventually attracted mainstream attention. They even got shout-outs from one of the actors when he was on Jimmy Fallon, and also developed a viral following on X and TikTok. Not long after that surge, some private text messages from one of the Empty Netter hosts was published. These messages were sent prior to the podcast watching the show, and they were very dismissive of the show and were a stark contrast to the thoughtful, enthusiastic coverage that had followed publicly. The publication of those text messages reframed the conversation. So for me, what had been about a television show and its unexpected reach has now become a debate about intent, ownership, and who had the right to represent and profit from that moment. In terms of why I think the Empty Netters reviews got more traction and were more popular, these are my thoughts. The piece of context that tends to get quietly ignored when What Chaos frames this coverage as uniquely in their lane. Some have tried to say that Empty Netters covering Heated Rivalry was a sudden genre betrayal or opportunistic pivot into pop culture. But if you look at their channel, like What Chaos, they have covered hockey films and hockey television. They've covered all of the Mighty Ducks films, Mystery Alaska. They even covered what looks like a really terrible movie called MVP, Most Valuable Primate. They have spent time on hockey as a cultural object, not just as a sport. I should note they haven't covered everything because they didn't do the original Youngblood, nor did they do my beloved Hockey Night, which featured Megan Follows. But the idea that it was strange or out of character for them to engage with a television show about hockey simply doesn't hold up. The reason I'm mentioning that is because it does undercut a claim by others that this was somehow an invasion of someone else's territory or turf. I think that the reason the empty netters landed isn't because they were perfect allies to the queer community. It's because they weren't. They came across as quintessential, stereotypical, recognizable hockey bros. Dismissive at first, skeptical, a little embarrassed by how much they ended up caring, and then they visibly changed and weren't embarrassed about it at all. The reason that shift matters more than ideological purity is that watching someone move from eye rolling to attention, from detachment to actual engagement, gives other people permission to follow. It's kind of daunting to think that you've got to be perfect from the get go, but the idea that you can grow and develop over time and that it's possible for anybody is a much more attractive proposition. So that's the bridge that people keep talking about. It's not that empty netters were enlightened, it's because they were probably a bit more relatable. Now let's get to the text messages and the contradiction that everyone can't stop staring at. These were private messages in which Dan Powers described the show as trash, pandering, something not worth real respect. I think he sledged Canada a bit, and the messages were definitely a sharp contradiction to the very thoughtful, detailed public coverage that they gave during their reaction videos and their review videos. For a lot of people, this is where the conversation froze. Either the text invalidated everything that came after, or the later enthusiasm magically erased the earlier contempt. I actually don't think either of those positions holds true. The contradiction is the point. It exposes how often media engagement begins cynically and becomes sincere later, and how uncomfortable we are admitting that transformation is difficult. I think this is where my own discomfort with the cancellation comes in. There seems to be a rule that operates online that once you have said something stupid, that's who you are forever, and that growth doesn't count, context doesn't matter, and change is cosmetic rather than real. That framework doesn't allow people to move from ignorance to understanding. It demands that you stay where you started, in the dark, while those who now occupy the position of enlightenment act as if they've always been there and you can never get there. I don't think anyone springs fully formed into moral clarity. Even someone like DJ Bean, who claims that he is such an enlightened ally, he would have started from somewhere just like the rest of us. The difference, I think, is whether we have the grace and allow people to move to a better place. So, what bothers me about freezing people at their worst moment is that it punishes the very behavior we claim to want. If changing your mind doesn't matter, then there's no incentive to try. I'm a big fan of the Stormlight archive, and there's a line, well, there's quite a few lines actually from the character Dalinar Kholin that capture this a lot better than I can. He says, "Sometimes the hypocrite is nothing more than a man in the process of changing." He also says, "A journey will have pain and failure. It is not only the steps forward that we must accept, it is the stumbles, the trials, the knowledge that we will fail, that we will hurt those around us. But if we stop, if we accept the person we are when we fail, the journey ends and the failure becomes our destination." He also says, "The most important words a person can say are, 'I will do better.' The most important step a person can take is the next one." So to put it another way, saying something ignorant once should not sentence you to stay ignorant forever. Growth is the point, and if we deny people the ability to change, we don't create accountability, we actually create stagnation. Before going any further, I do want to be explicit about something. Empty netters are not above critique. They have definitely used questionable language in the past, about women, about gay people, and that history definitely matters. If they want to position themselves as allies going forward, reflection and accountability are part of that work, even if they want to keep being a Hockey Bro podcast. But for me, that is a separate conversation and related to the one I mentioned about changing. That's not about this specific issue. What I am discussing here is not whether empty netters are good people or whether they've always spoken well. It's about whether their participation in this moment expanded the space, and whether the reaction to their success was about harm or about ownership. These two questions shouldn't be conflated and collapsed into one, because doing so obscures what's actually happened. Empty Netters didn't just recap the show, they normalized caring about it inside hockey culture, and they treated it as something worth time and discussion. You can dislike their motivations and still acknowledge the impact. Both things can be true here. This is where I'm going to get to the really difficult and challenging part, which I know could be potentially quite controversial. It's about the gatekeeper instinct and being first versus letting it spread. There's a moment on the podcast Drop Your Buffs where DJ Bean explains in his own words what he believes the real issue is. The two of them from the What Chaos podcast were guests on Drop Your Buffs. DJ Bean references a Threads post lamenting that What Chaos is never getting mentioned as the first hockey podcast bros to actually cover Heated Rivalry. He notes that the show's producer Jacob Tierney agreed with this, and this agreement clearly matters to DJ Bean. From there, the framing tightens. The concern isn't simply that Heated Rivalry is being talked about. It's who is being centered in the conversation and who isn't. Although Bean says that he is resisting the idea that this cultural moment should be framed around straight white men reacting to a gay show, he then says he wants to make sure that in what he calls an amazing moment for a gay Canadian series, it doesn't become about straight hockey guys discovering it. It's not quite the whole story. What he says is presented as principled, but I'm not sure it necessarily is. In this podcast and in other podcasts, he has repeatedly emphasized that What Chaos occupied a weird lane that no one else wanted. He said they were doing something different while other hockey podcasts weren't. He says their audience is loyal but modest until Heated Rivalry unlocked a much larger group of fans. At one point, he says, and I will quote, "That's why I think that anybody who knows us and knew our show was like, you guys have to cover this. Whereas a lot of the other hockey podcasts, they're surprised that there would be a willingness to cover it." That sentence isn't neutral. It's ranking people and setting a hierarchy. It is passing judgment. This is reinforced somewhere else in his own words. He says, when he's describing the wave of straight hockey podcasts covering Heated Rivalry, he says, "We accidentally began like a trend or genre of podcast in which straight hockey people react to Heated Rivalry with varying degrees of sincerity." Again, that phrasing is not neutral. It doesn't just describe difference. He's ranking it. He is drawing a boundary between us and other hockey podcasts. He is implying that covering a queer, pop culture-driven hockey show was natural and obvious for them, and unexpected and even unlikely for everybody else. And this is how gatekeeping often sounds in practice, not as exclusion, but as authorship. I'm not saying he's being hostile about it, but there's definitely an implication that this is mine, not yours. By framing other coverage as having varying degrees of sincerity, he implicitly positions his own engagement as the standard, purer because it started from the right place, more valid because it didn't require conversion. Sincerity in this framing isn't something you arrive at, it's something you either possess from the beginning or never truly have. And that is why, for me, this is where the tone transmuted into something that was a lot uglier. It became pettiness and jealousy dressed up as principle. He went further, describing the influx of new fans as people who either sat out hockey culture until his show made it accessible, or arrived because of Heated Rivalry coverage. The scale is described not as incremental but exponential. Taken together, the message is quite clear. They didn't just participate in this moment. They created it. They made it safe. They made it happen. That is the hinge point. Because at the same time they are rejecting straight male centering in theory, he is asserting primacy in practice, not over Heated Rivalry itself, but over the reaction economy that surrounded it. DJ Bean is claiming ownership. The desire isn't only for the conversation to be respectful, It's for them to be remembered correctly, to receive due attribution, for credit to be assigned. That seems like gatekeeping to me. When it's wrapped up in progressive language, I don't think that makes it more ethical or palatable. It actually makes it more distasteful, as far as I'm concerned. Virtue signaling, moral elevation, and the ally who thinks he's different. I do want to be precise here. I don't think DJ Bean is being actively malicious. I don't think he wakes up intending to harm queer creators or sabotage other podcasts. But what I do think is that he has thoroughly convinced himself that he occupies a morally superior position, not just compared to traditional hockey media, but compared to other straight hockey podcasts. This belief shows up repeatedly in his own language. In his podcasts and in other podcasts, he has described himself as straight only because of biology. He jokes that his straightness is something imposed on him. He says more than once that he would rather be mistaken for gay than be described as painfully straight. He frames straightness as an unfortunate condition rather than a neutral fact. For instance, he says, "My straightness is purely biological." He says, "I wish that I weren't as straight." This isn't self-deprecation or a joke, it's actually moral positioning. The implication is clear. He is saying, if sexuality was a choice, he would choose correctly. If ethics were the measure, he would land closer to queer people than to other straight men. And this is how he seems to have elevated himself. It allows him to present not just as an ally to the queer community, but a better ally, and one who should not be grouped with other straight hockey podcasters. He deserves a different kind of credit, one who is almost exempt from the structural critique that applies to everyone else. This is why his reaction to being described as painfully straight matters so much. It isn't about accuracy so much as hierarchy. Being called straight collapses the distinction that he seems to have spent years trying to build, and this is where I think the delusion creeps in. Allyship isn't proximity or fluency. It isn't how uncomfortable you are with your own straightness, and it certainly isn't about how much you wish you were something else. Allyship is action, and action includes what you do when success, credit, and visibility flow to someone else for the common good other than you. A person who is secure in their allyship does not need to assert moral superiority. They do not need to frame themselves as an exception. They do not need to suggest that other straight podcasts are more suspect, more surprising, or less willing than they are. By positioning himself as uniquely enlightened, as straight, but not that kind of straight, DJ Bean ends up doing the very thing he claims to oppose. He recenters himself, not maliciously or consciously, but very consistently. This is why the posture feels worse than genuine cluelessness. A convert who starts in the wrong place and changes in public expands the space. Someone who believes he is already sufficiently virtuous, already almost there, already adjacent to queerness by virtue of attitude, has nothing left to learn. That actually isn't allyship. It seems more like self-regard and even a touch of arrogance. And sorry for only mentioning one of the hosts. I am fully aware that What Chaos has 3 podcast hosts, but only one of them tends to display these behaviors on a consistent basis. Now let's go to the fact that podcasting isn't a moral economy. It's an attention economy. Downloads, clips, virality, sponsorships. These aren't side details. They're the scoreboard and the metrics. And when another show suddenly captures the audience that you thought was yours, I guess it doesn't feel abstract anymore. It feels quite personal. So that's the lens that I'm using here. It's not about being villainous. It's about the analytics and the incentives. No one has confirmed where the leaked text came from. I'm not claiming to know. There's a lot of speculation. After listening to both of these shows, since even before they started reviewing Heated Rivalry, their tone, their language, their fixations, I'm drawing my own inferences, and people can draw their own as well. I should also say that I feel especially uneasy about the fact that a queer publication like Outsports has been used as the delivery mechanism for a story that primarily benefits straight media rival podcasts. It doesn't mean the reporting was necessarily wrong, but it does mean that the context matters. And I feel like there's been some weaponization here that really doesn't sit well with me. Now, I'm going to discuss protection versus possession and who gets to arrive late. There's another layer here that matters, and it relates to what I discussed earlier. What Chaos repeatedly frames its relationship to Heated Rivalry as protective, as care, as stewardship. They recognized its value long before anybody else did. But as I've mentioned, that protection in practice looks like they're claiming ownership. They continually emphasize that they were, from an early stage, wanting to watch it. They covered it before it was popular. They were willing to engage when others weren't. They saw past what the show appeared to be on the surface. Crucially, they seem to treat that early adoption as a kind of moral credential. The unspoken rule becomes that if you weren't on board from the beginning, your later enthusiasm is suspect. We've definitely seen this with things like movies, musical artists, when newer fans are accused of not being genuine fans because they jumped on the bandwagon. It's a little bit darker in this context just because of the subject matter. And this is where the contempt for podcasts like Empty Netters seems to have crept in. I've mentioned that they didn't want to watch it at first, that they were skeptical, that they were dismissive. They were treating it the way that the show openly marketed itself, as gay hockey smut. As I mentioned, the inconvenient truth here is that this is actually how the show has been marketed, even by the showrunners themselves. They leaned into that framing. They called themselves smut. They extolled the fact that it was explicit. They definitely didn't lead with its emotional depth, character work, or acting. So when a lot of people initially responded with skepticism, I don't think that that is a moral failure on the part of an audience. It is a very predictable reaction to the way the show has presented itself. I'm going to be honest, that was my experience too. I am a really big hockey fan. I read hockey romance as well, but when I saw a lot of the trailers and the publicity for this show, I wasn't actually intending to watch it because it did feel like potentially a rather cynical cash grab for a niche market. So I actually started watching the recaps and the reviews first. I watched What Chaos and then I watched Empty Netters. What I saw with Empty Netters was something a bit different. With episodes 1 and 2, they were quite cautious, flippant, a bit jokey. They weren't really sure what they were watching yet, and so there were a few uncomfortable, stupid jokes. But by episode 3, it was very clear to me that something had shifted, and all three of the hosts were very much all in. They were no longer being ironic or defensive, they were genuinely invested in the storylines and the show. And the best thing about it is that their reviews didn't actually contain any of the virtue signaling that I was seeing in the What Chaos reviews. The Empty Netters were framing it more like we're fans of good stuff. This is good. It's just sort of objectively good. We kind of don't really care about any of the other stuff. We think it's well acted. It's a romantic story and it's really good. Whereas with the What Chaos reviews, although there was definitely genuine fandom, particularly from Sean, I think, but sometimes when they were reviewing it, it almost felt like they wanted a pat on the back. So it was after I watched the episode 3 review by Empty Netters that I started watching the show for myself. Not because I was told that I should, but because I watched someone else realize in real time that this show had heart and it became interesting to me. Whereas What Chaos seemed to think that in order to hold a belief that is legitimate, you must hold it immediately, and that an enthusiasm that arrives late is less authentic. It's almost like conversion only counts as if it happens on their timetable. I kind of see it in the hockey world as well. A lot of fans get very critical if people are considered to be bandwagon fans, like if you only start following a team once they start winning and that kind of thing. But like I said, it's a little bit darker and a bit more sinister in this particular context just because of the subject matter. As I've said above, most people don't actually arrive into the world fully formed. We need time, context, and the ability to be wrong first. I don't necessarily think it's always opportunism and that this is actually how culture spreads. By treating early skepticism as disqualifying, people like What Chaos collapse growth into purity and confuse being first with being right. And in doing so, they mistake protection for possession. The other thing that made me uncomfortable was the idea of the hypocrisy that I was seeing. If this was about genuine allyship, then I think that What Chaos's reaction to the success of a podcast like Empty Netters would have been uncomplicated. They would have been happy that the audience exploded and that the message was reaching people that might not otherwise have been reached. They should have had relief that queer stories were reaching people who had never engaged with them before. They should have had pride that hockey culture, even slightly, was growing and being shared with the wider community. But that is not what happened. What happened instead appears to have been resentment. It wasn't resentment that the conversation existed, but almost that it didn't belong to the people who believed that they had earned it. And this is where the hypocrisy becomes impossible for me to ignore. What Chaos also monetized this moment. There's nothing wrong with what they did, but they launched a Patreon pretty much directly after the influx of attention that they generated from their Heated Rivalry reviews. They also benefited from the same surge in interest. They didn't refuse to profit on ethical grounds. They were participating in the same economy. They just weren't as successful as the Empty Netters were about it. So the objection cannot honestly be that straight men shouldn't capitalize on queer media. The objection seemed to be that the wrong straight podcasters were doing it better. I had noticed early on that the Empty Netters hadn't erased What Chaos. They'd credited them openly, they praised them, they even said in the comments, we're friends with them, we're not competing. They openly acknowledged that the groundwork had already been laid. In the early days, I saw no disparaging remarks made. The reason their videos became more popular, as I've mentioned, was that they connected more deeply and more visibly. Their coverage was longer, they were emotionally engaged, and all three of their hosts were clearly invested. It was very collective. In contrast, on What Chaos, the enthusiasm was quite concentrated. DJ Bean and the producer Sean were driving most of the conversation and the energy. The third host, Pete, often sounded like he was enduring the experience rather than leaning into it. It might have just been his manner. Like his wife did give the other hosts banana socks. So clearly he was invested. He just didn't look that invested. But I think audiences were quite good at noticing that difference, and they really responded to what they felt was the unashamed enthusiasm and sincerity that the Empty Netter reviews were projecting. And honestly, there is no rule, whether moral, cultural, or otherwise, that says that only one straight hockey podcast is allowed to cover a gay hockey show. There is absolutely no entitlement attached to being first and no ethical claim to exclusivity. The only thing that has been violated here was an expectation that if this space grew, it would grow through What Chaos and that they would get the credit. So that is why DJ Bean's language keeps circling ownership terminology. The surprise that others would even be willing to cover it. Audience expansion framed as something that they unlocked. Possession masquerading as principle. So I'm not saying that they leaked the private texts, but I doubt they were desperately unhappy that they have been leaked. I could see it all for myself because of the repeated emphasis on credit, the repeated displeasure when success flowed elsewhere, the repeated moral framing that collapsed the moment control was lost. So this isn't a story about villains and heroes, it's about incentives, ego, and what happens when allyship is treated as identity rather than action. A clueless convert who changes in public expands the space. A fluent, status-conscious ally who believes the space should belong to him shrinks it. That difference matters more than who was first. The story here does not end with a moral victory. No one is covered in glory. It's all extremely gross. We have a clearer picture of how hockey media actually works, how scarcity thinking, analytics, and personal branding collide with progressive language. Empty Netters weren't villains or saints. What Chaos, and especially DJ Bean, weren't villains or saints. But a reaction to another podcast success tells you far more than a claim to virtue ever could. So I guess this video was just about me thinking aloud about who celebrates growth, who resents it when it doesn't center around them, and what does that all mean? And why does it matter?